Welcome to Trench Diaries. This is Blood, Dust and Snow, Chapter 16. Now before we continue with the diary, here's a general overview over the situation on the Eastern Front in the time frame of October the 2nd, 1941 to September the 18th, 1942. At the beginning of October 1941, the German army drew together 3 panzer and 2 infantry armies, 78 divisions totaling nearly 2 million men, to finally end the war which it had started 4 months earlier. German troops occupied a front line over 350 kilometers in length. Their objective, the capture of Moscow, the capital of the Soviet Union. To achieve this, the last available reserves had been scraped together. The panzer divisions which had been tasked to capture Leningrad were shifted south, while the continuation of the advance in Ukraine was left in the hands of Romanian formations. Yet, even after the implementation of these measures, there was little reason for optimism. In the first 3 months of the war against the Soviet Union, the German army of the East had lost more than 500,000 men. Every 6th German soldier had been killed or severely wounded. In addition to these unprecedented losses, only a third of the 3,600 tanks with which the army had gone to war were still operational, and even for these, fuel supplies near the front line were insufficient to sustain a long-winded offensive. However, German High Command assumed that the outcome of the campaign in the East had been decided and that the Red Army had been beaten. Since the great battles of encirclement in the previous summer, more than 1.5 million Soviet soldiers had marched into German captivity, at least 500,000 more had been killed, and 5,500 Russian tanks had been destroyed or captured. It would turn out to be a false assumption with far-reaching and dramatic consequences. Operation Typhoon commenced on September 30th, 1941. The 6th Panzer Division, with Panzer-Regiment 11 on the lead, launched its attack as part of General Hoth's 3rd Panzer Army on October 2nd, deeply penetrating the Russian lines north of Vyazma. In the previous weeks, the divisions had lost a large number of its tanks to technical breakdowns and enemy action. By September 10th, it had lost 47 Panzer 35Ts. Now, Panzer-Regiment 11 was combined with Panzer-Regiment 25 to form the temporary Panzer Brigade Kol, which broke through the Russian lines north of Vyazma and crossed the Dnieper River a day later. Yet by then, the weather had turned and the continuous autumn rain turned the roads into seas of thick, sticky mud, which resulted in a near total stop of movement, and operations came to a standstill, giving the Red Army the respite it needed to complete and consolidate its defensive positions and to replenish its forces. Between October 2nd and 11th, the 5th Company of Panzer Regiment 11 had lost 18 of its complement of 24 tanks. The entire 2nd Abteilung of the regiment had shrunk to the strength of a single weak company. On October 12th, Friedrich Sander, without tanks to lead, was transferred to a new temporary post as courier to the 1B, the 2nd General Staff Officer and head of supply of the 6th Panzer Division, a post which offered ample opportunity to observe and ponder life behind the lines. On October 16th, the 6th Panzer Division counted only 60 operational tanks of all types, and less than 2 weeks later only 34 of its Panzer 35Ts were still operational. On October 17th, when frost had hardened the ground sufficiently for operations to continue, the division's few remaining tanks rolled east in the hope of capturing Moscow before the onset of winter. In the middle of November, German troops resumed their attack on what their propaganda called the capital of Jewish Bolshevism, with 2 panzer groups attacking the town of Klin, north of Moscow. On November 19th, Friedrich Sander was recalled to Panzer Regiment 11, where he rejoined his old company in Geshatsk. The regiment, with its armored strength severely depleted, had been pulled out of the line into a quiet area and was waiting to be transported back to Germany for refit. The pace of the German advance had slowed considerably, not only due to fierce resistance of the withdrawing Red Army troops, but also due to the weather conditions. On November the 27th, the temperatures had for the first time fallen to minus 35 degrees Celsius, brutal even by Russian standards. The cold froze equipment, shut down diesel engines, and took a heavy toll on the German frontline soldiers who, in expectation of a short campaign, had not been issued with sufficient winter clothing. By now, serious logistical issues prevented the delivery of warm clothing and other winter equipment from the depots in Germany and Poland to where it was actually needed. On November the 28th, in heavy snowfall and freezing temperatures, the 6th Panzer Division, having captured the strategically important town of Rogachevo, stood about 30 kilometers in front of the Volga-Moscow Canal. In some places, German troops were less than 20 kilometers from the outskirts of Moscow itself. On the same day, the unthinkable happened. The last operational tank of Panzer-Regiment 11 had to be blown up after breaking down. 2 days later, the last operational Panzer 35T of the division had to be destroyed. On December the 10th, for the first time since the outbreak of the war, the 6th Panzer Division did not have a single working tank at its disposal. The once so powerful formation had become jokingly known as a Panzer Division on foot. From then on, the only available armored strength came in the form of whatever vehicles could be spontaneously made serviceable, patched up, and repaired enough to be thrown into combat. On December the 1st, a motorcycle patrol of Panzer Pioneer Battalion 62 reached Khimki, a small river port in the northwest suburbs of Moscow, 8 kilometers from the city and less than 20 kilometers from the Kremlin. Yet, the ring around the city had still not been closed. The German panzer groups slowly ground to a halt. Since the beginning of November, Army Group Center had lost nearly 46,000 men killed. The hopes of the men of Panzer Regiment 11 that they would soon be reunited with their families were shattered only a day later. Faced with a severe shortage of men, the regiment was ordered to form a battalion of infantry which would be used to secure and defend the rearward lines, thus freeing up regular infantry units for service at the front. It was a terrible blow for Sander, who suddenly found himself in command of a company of about 80 badly equipped men who, using more sturdy, captured Russian lorries, were transported towards their defensive positions near Klin. The German army did not have winter quarters, there were no barracks, and the little available shelter often consisted only of local villages with mostly small houses. With the lack of food and suitable winter clothing, casualties caused by hunger, epidemics, and frostbite soon began to spiral out of control. Some regiments, once 3,000 men strong, had shrunk to fighting strength of 500 men or less. The Wehrmachtsoffensive had been stopped, but German intelligence still estimated that Soviet forces had been broken, that they had no more reserves left, and that Stalin was unable to launch a counter-offensive. An estimate which would prove catastrophically wrong. On December 5, 1941, Stavka, the supreme command of the Soviet armed forces, unleashed its great counter-offensive along the entire front. In secret, entirely undetected by German intelligence, Russia had managed to assemble more than 1 million men, 780 tanks, and 5,700 guns. While along the entire Eastern Front these numbers were not much greater than those of the German army, Stavka had concentrated troops in several key areas to achieve local superiority. To break the German grip on Moscow, 34 Siberian divisions, superbly trained and equipped for winter warfare, had been assembled. Those German units the Red Army did not overrun immediately had no other option than try saving themselves with a hasty retreat, but even that frequently failed. Smaller German formations were often outflanked, surrounded and annihilated, and not only in front of Moscow but also in Ukraine, in Crimea and at Leningrad. This hammer blow of the Russian offensive had thrown the units of Army Group Center into a hasty retreat. To deny the rapidly advancing troops of the Red Army shelter and to delay the speed of their advance, the retreating Germans tried to leave only scorched earth to their foe. In some areas, entire villages were put to the torch. In some cases, the local population was driven into no man's land between the opposing forces in an effort to stall the speed of the Soviet advance. In other places, inhabitants sympathetic to the German cause were allowed to evacuate themselves and their belongings into less important settlements. From a military perspective, this had the desired effect. Yet, in the freezing temperature, the loss of their homes must have been equal to a death sentence for many of the local people. For the first time, the violence and brutality directed against what clearly were innocent people, old men, women and children, managed to shake the conscience of even a hard man like Friedrich Sander, whose writing in this period turns increasingly dark and gloomy. German troops, once it was certain that Moscow could not be taken in one final effort, were not only physically but also mentally exhausted. Everywhere, heavy equipment and vehicles without fuel were abandoned and blown up. Many German soldiers lost their trust in the military leadership entirely, releasing social Darwinist energies, which in turn led to more violence and crime. Bothersome prisoners of war were often shot, civilians were plundered and expelled, and their livelihoods destroyed. On December the 16th, Adolf Hitler issued his infamous halt order, which strictly forbade any further withdrawal unless approved by Hitler himself, a blanket solution heavily based on ideological precepts which immensely hampered Army Group Center's flexibility to respond. As such, it caused great resentment among German commanders who, from then on, had to find creative ways to oppose and outmaneuver the dangerous Haltebefehl, purposely defying Hitler, who assumed that the main requirement for holding a position was the iron will to do so. On December the 19th, Sander and a small group of men under his command arrived at the temporary safety of Charkovskaya after having covered a distance of over 110 kilometers in a fighting retreat through ice and snow. On New Year's Eve, Sander and his men unexpectedly found themselves at the sharp end of yet another attack by the Red Army, which resulted in a further fighting withdrawal through ice and snow, and for the first time since the beginning of the campaign, Sander's diary falls silent except for a few hastily scribbled words in his notebook. Weeks later, he would briefly reflect on this period when he and his men stood helpless in the face of an onslaught by heavy Russian tanks, listing the names of the friends he lost in battle, wounded comrades left behind to freeze to death in the snow, and how he and a handful of comrades only barely managed to save their own lives. The great Russian counterattack, however, was at best a hollow victory. While it did push the German army further away from Moscow, the Red Army only managed to recapture 7% of the territory conquered by the Wehrmacht during the preceding months. And while the losses of Army Group Center had been high, they were dwarfed by those suffered by the Red Army, which was losing over 500,000 men per month during the period, about 6 times more than the German invaders. Not a single German division had been destroyed. No major breakthrough had been achieved. In the end, the Soviet offensive fizzled out, leaving the German forces well positioned to initiate another major offensive that would come the following spring. After the stabilization of the front, Panzer-Regiment 11 was deployed in the Rzhev area, and in May 1942 it was transferred to France to be refreshed. In the coming months, Sander not only married but also decided to study economics and applied for leave to commence his studies in Berlin. Leave was granted and was to last from October 23, 1942 to April 2, 1943. It was cut short on November 8th when he was recalled to his regiment for its upcoming employment on the Eastern Front. The diary continues now. October 2, 1941, Thursday, before the attack. From our deployment area, both regiments 11 and 25 first rolled in the wrong direction, which took us too far towards the north. But then the scene that unfolded before our eyes was tremendous. Hundreds of tanks attacked and rolled across the open plain. Shells detonated between us, forcing us to pull our heads in and button up. When we rolled over the first line of enemy positions, which had already been traversed by our infantry, we were eagerly fired upon by wounded and single-hiding Russians. The furthermost Russian position consisted of well-constructed trench systems. We then approached a wide-open bush terrain, one of the kind so typical for Russia, and then fanned out into a broad wedge formation. After that, we stopped and waited to be marshaled in to attack a hill northeast of our position, marked by 2 leafless trees and a steep peak on the left side of the hill. We climb back into our tanks, wait until the order to attack is given, and roll forward. I am in the first wave with my platoon, Auris is on the left and Oswald is forming the reserve. I had lost Grave to a breakdown and he was now slowly catching up from the rear. As a result, I had only 4 tanks. While we are traversing the first dense bushes going stubbornly forward without being able to observe the enemy, we are called to turn to the right. Head towards the sun, it is called. That is always nice, driving into the sun with squinting eyes and unable to see anything ahead. It's not even worth mentioning that it's impossible to see anything through the check optics if there was the need to fire. I stubbornly roll forward through the dense bushes. I don't give a crap. It's pretty clear that someone at the top made a bullshit decision without marshalling us in. Feldwebel Engelhardt is rolling forward on my left, Feldwebel Goslar to the right, and Unteroffizier Albert next to him. Suddenly, the vehicle is shaken by an enormous bang, so violent that my microphone, headphones, and cap are blown off my head. For a moment, I can't hear anything, and clumps of earth rain down through the open turret hatch. The tank stands still. For a moment, I think we've been hit by artillery, but when I lift my head out of the turret to see what has happened, I notice a big hole in the ground under the track. "Mines! Mines!" I shout to the radio operator so he can pass it on to the rest of the company before they all snuff it in the minefield. But it's already too late. A bang on our left side and one on the right, followed by another one. The radio operator is shouting back that the apparatus isn't working. The enormous pressure has blown the receiver out of its socket. Screams and groans on the left and right. It did have a greater effect there than it had on us. I dismount and first run over to the left to Engelhardt, where Otto Müller is just being lowered into the grass. Trauthoff is sitting on the ground groaning. Engelhardt himself is bleeding on the forehead. Only Endermann is unscathed. First of all, I start uncovering the mine system in the close vicinity around us. We learned how to handle that at Leningrad. One can roughly estimate where the things lie buried. These damned green wooden boxes filled with what looks like small rolls of shaving soap. Suddenly, the ground gives way below one of my feet. For a moment, I am frozen stiff with shock and my heart skips a beat. Below the thin layer of grass, the green wood of a box mine becomes visible, but nothing happens. I haven't broken the thin sharepin of the mine. The shock, however, has shaken me to the bone. Otto Müller is groaning and groaning. He must be in terrible pain. I start to help the poor boy as well as I can. With my pocket knife, I cut the trousers from his body. Engelhardt is helping and carefully pulls one boot off the one foot, the other is totally shredded. The kneecap of one leg is mostly gone and thick blood is oozing from a wound in the thigh of the other. I remove a few scraps of fabric from the wound before we apply a tourniquet. His testicles are all bloody. I ask him if he can feel pain there. He doesn't know. I carefully examine him. He seems to have some major bruising there, but otherwise everything looks intact. Thank God for him. Trauthoff's calf is swelling up a lot. It isn't life-threatening, so we'll have to check him over later. First, we have to help Goslar, who is still in the vehicle. While we are heading there, I uncover a few more mines to make sure no one runs into them, which could potentially endanger us too. Right beside the right track of my vehicle, there is another mine which has already been slightly pushed in. I can feel my heart beating in my throat while I remove its grass cover. It has to be done. Stabsarzt Möschler is already at work at Goslar's vehicle. On this tank, the mine hasn't exerted its force towards the side as it did on ours, where it just blew off a track and a roller. Instead, it has smashed in the underside of the hull with the floor hatch and shredded everything inside. They have managed to pull Goslar out alive, but both his legs are badly torn up. The surgeon and I applied tourniquets. Both legs are only attached to the body by thin strips of sinew and flesh. Goslar doesn't want to stay still. He has gone insane. He has started to sing with a slurring voice, so great is his pain. He can't see us anymore. His left eye has turned pallid and lost its color, while the nerve of the right one seems to have been damaged by a splinter in his brow. With a knife and a pair of scissors, the doctor and I cut away the remains of his trousers so we can apply the rubber tourniquets. The doctor wants to move on and follow the regiment. I am to call for Oberarzt Menke and an armored personnel carrier over the radio. Krautwig, the orderly officer, pulls up with his vehicle and tries to help as well as he can. All the tanks of Abteilung 65 and the 1st Abteilung which are rolling past have no connection or can only reach the company. I send 2 of my men, Wilhelm Müller and Tutasch, to the advance road to stop and fetch a Sanka. Möschler doesn't even have a stretcher with him. I dress Goslar's head. Korte is also standing with us. He is wounded in the arm. With 2 wooden poles, which I found at the boundary of the minefield, and a Russian tent square, I fashioned a crude stretcher for Goslar. We carefully rest him on it and then carry him to a farm track on which our tanks are rolling past. His face is already turning yellow. It dawns on me that he probably won't survive. Next, I have to take care of Oberholz. He's still sitting in the driver's seat of his tank and is unable to move. He doesn't want us to touch him and demands to stay in the tank. He doesn't care about anything anymore. 2 men then carefully lift him out anyway. His spine is broken and he is totally paralyzed. He can hardly speak any longer. We place a rolled-up coat under his head. "Lieutenant Sander, I don't lie properly. My head is too low. Lieutenant Sander, my head is up too high." It is just awful. I briefly jump onto the tank to look at Wiegand. I've had enough. I want to scream. I just want to scream it all away. My nerves can't take it anymore. Nearby, Unteroffizier Albert uncovers a cartridge box which has been filled with explosives and buried as a mine. It is a cursed, shitty work. Any moment you can step on one. Müller and Tutasch return with stretchers. In the meantime, Goslar's suffering has ended. He's dead. We cover his horribly mangled corpse with a Russian tent square and then place Otto Müller on a stretcher. His whole body is shaking and trembling from limb to limb, a symptom of blood loss. While we are dressing his wounds, I place a small piece of wood between his teeth and tell him to bite down hard on it should the pain get too much to bear. But he's too weak to do even that. Finally, we carry Trauthoff to the Zanka on a Russian stretcher. On the way, I step on another mine right beside Engelhardt's tank. When we had carried all the wounded to the Zanka, which couldn't come nearer than 500 meters, we began to remove Wiegand's body from the tank. The boy didn't have to suffer long. Life must have left the totally destroyed body in an instant. Little Zimmermann placed a recovery belt about Wiegand's remains, but we couldn't pull him out as his feet were stuck somewhere. I had to take a pickaxe from the tank and began to free the mangled body. The battery had been pushed into his lower abdomen, a foot lay between the wooden ammunition boxes, his body was torn open and the flesh was hanging down his leg. The stench of the warm blood was mixing with that of the battery acid. Everything I touched was slick with blood. His head had been caved in. Tell me again about dying a hero's death. This war is the most horrible of things. There's nothing beautiful or grand about it, only the hard and cold necessity, the damned duty and obligation, and the idea of a greater Reich and the security of our families at home, which is standing behind everything. On the desks of the pencil pushers, this is, of course, very different. No whistling bullets and explosions. No sweeter death than to die in the face of the enemy. Is that really true? All of a sudden, Fedder appeared, and in the meantime, Müller had repaired the radio and established a connection to Hille. I told Hille that I would go back with Fedder's tank, so Powell got out and remained with my crew, while I took command of his tank, in which, after loading it up with things and changing the radio over, I followed the regiment. Saying farewell to my men was incredibly hard. A last salute to the 2 fallen comrades who lay at the roadside covered with tent squares, and then I followed the enemy, humming the first stanza of the Panzerlied. In the evening we caught up with the rest of the company. Most of them had already crossed the Kokosch. I can't help being impressed by the enormous number of troops here. We traversed the Russian artillery positions, and shortly before reaching the Kokosch, Hauptmann Hagemann came toward us. But damn, isn't that Auris's tank? What the hell has happened? "We have favorable Auris in the tank, he was shot in the head," Servas shouted over. I quickly climbed on the other tank to take a quick look at Auris. He knelt inside the fighting compartment, resting his bleeding bandaged head against a machine gun ammunition box. 1 man was holding and supporting him. Auris couldn't speak. His larynx had been hurt as well. We then rolled through the furthermost lines of the infantry and crossed the Kokosch via a ford. Soon I was back with my lot and took command of 3rd Platoon, which was made up of a crew of Fröhlich, Krone and Hünecker, so there were 4 tanks in total. Nearby stood a 15-centimeter gun. Its towing tractor had burned out. A few men are fumbling around with the breech, and I give them a proper bollocking. I've seen something similar at Tavtushche in Lithuania, where one of those Rushkas was still loaded and suddenly went off. A barrel burst of that caliber has quite an effect. An advancing group of infantrymen is suddenly taken under fire from some foxholes near the street, not 20 meters away from us. After we've thrown a hand grenade into one of the holes, 5 stagger out. 1 has a foot torn off by the grenade. He's shot dead by the infantry. Our panzermen would have gunned down the other Russians too, but I managed to stop them. At about the same moment, a whole kette of Stukas flew over and dived downwards just ahead of us. Our guys fired white signal flares and ignited yellow smoke charges, but one of those idiots still dropped his 3 bombs. Our infantry, now mistaking them for Russians, opened fire on the Stukas, and just as they had disappeared, some Russian Curtises appeared. I was sitting in the turret writing my diary when suddenly explosive rounds detonated on and among the vehicles. What a goddamn mess. During the night, our advance continued down a wide new road. At Bykova, we deployed for all-round defense, while ahead the sky was illuminated by the 4 burning villages which were being pounded by the artillery. A bit further away, an ammunition dump exploded. October the 3rd, 1941, 0900. The attack is rolling. Should our sister regiment encounter no resistance in the forests here, she will push past Kolm towards the Dnieper. If they do meet resistance, we'll move into the forest on the left. Our Abteilung is rolling forward now. I spent the night sleeping in the tank and I am quite refreshed. My nerves were completely wrecked. It was incredibly difficult to just change into Fedder's tank and continue rolling forward. Of what use is Hillis' praise? Apart from the boss, the only other company officer left is Wilhelm Lope, and he is a Panzer IV. It was my fucking duty and obligation to drive at the front. I have to leave nerve problems to men like Zangenmeister, Neuling, Baum, Dermin and others. This shall be the end of it. I am not thinking about all this anymore. Even the staff surgeon with his Iron Cross first class turned pale and no longer professional was driven mad when he saw the shredded bodies and Oberholz couldn't move anymore with his broken back. And Otto Müller lying there moaning, groaning and asking for his Zanka. I hope that Oberholz won't be injured any further on transport. His nerves were wrecked too, and he always asked me to reposition his head. Poor little Wiegand. I am starting to weep again when I think about him. One of those moments when the only thing one can do is to take a deep breath and keep calm. After my experiences, I would now, if I wasn't too old, choose to become a doctor after the war. While I was treating the wounded yesterday, I kept calm. But afterwards, when I saw the sad remains of my platoon and the wounded, I could not help breaking into tears. How terrible hard this war is. We're rolling. I've just written a few lines to mother and father, telling them that I am still well and healthy. Will I cross the Dnieper today? We drove south and it dawned on us that we were forming the Schwerpunkt of the attack due to the fact that this time the light of the burning villages was way behind our leading tanks. The roads were terrible. Röhlen is my driver, Brune is operating the radio, Müller III is my gunner, and on the way here we have rolled over a Russian ammunition supply column. Now the draft horses are standing, grazing at the roadside. A group of Stukas is coming back from a bombing raid, flying low over the treetops. We wave at them, and then it goes on, crossing over open terrain past Danilova and other villages on the way to the Dnieper. Behind Pustoshka, the Russians had dug an anti-tank trench which ran alongside a stream, similar to the defenses they had erected at Kolm. Abteilung 65 crossed the trench near Romaniki and Veselova and soon after ran into enemy tanks which had already been reported by our flyers. Nevertheless, the lead element lost 4 Skodas and a Panzer IV to the Russians and was forced to withdraw as quickly as possible when Russian infantry attempted to cut off their line of retreat towards the bridgehead. My platoon and Lopez Panzer IV were then employed to keep the Russian infantry in the trench in check. Oswald's platoon was covering our flank. We were successful and the Reds in the trench withdrew towards their main positions at Kolm. In the evening, my platoon was only 3 tanks strong, as Unteroffizier Kolnes' vehicle had broken down again. We spent the night sleeping beneath our tanks to be safe from the oncoming fire of Russian mortars and artillery. At 21:15, we were woken by a false alarm. A nervous Unteroffizier had mistaken a Russian shepherd and his herd for Russian infantry. He had seen movement, and when he had called upon the shepherd to identify himself, the man, instead of doing so, had thrown himself to the ground. The tides are turning. You've heard the brief summary at the beginning, and even though I'd like to think that I am pretty well read on the war, the sheer numbers when it comes to the losses of the warring parties are unbelievable. Can you imagine losing 500,000 soldiers a month like the Red Army did? This is inconceivable to the average person. And yet, the war would drag on for another 2.5 years. And the losses are showing to our man here. He has the first real encounter with death when his platoon runs into a minefield and soldiers are either mangled or gruesomely killed. He himself is very lucky, even stepping on a couple of mines without activating them. Considering these were anti-tank mines, the pressure required to detonate them was probably substantial, or else he would have vanished in a cloud of red mist. We're in late 1941 now, and it is only downhill from here, as you all know. So, see you next episode. Cheers.